I just got the news that the Russians have been judged to be in full default of their national debt by Moody's, which is kind of the keeper of the definition for what is a default and what is in good payment. This is taking us in a few weird directions because this has not happened and certainly not happened this way in quite some time. Normally, when a country goes into default, it's because they don't have enough money and they have to choose what to not pay for, whether it's to help out their own population, government services, infrastructure, their military, or their foreign debt. And if you choose foreign debt, that means you are cut out of capital markets for quite some time. But the problem here is not that the Russians have run out of money. The problem is that the Russians are not able to spend their money in the way that they would like. So they had actually set aside the money, even the hard currency necessary to make their payments. But the United States has denied them access to the various financial plumbing of the American system in order to allow that money to get to the actual bondholders. So from the Russian point of view, they haven't defaulted and they've got a reasonable position there, but it really doesn't matter because if you don't have access to the financial market and you can't move money around, then everything else is just kind of weird. But that does mean that investors are looking at this differently. This is not a situation where the Russians can just put a bunch of money into a FedEx envelope and send it off. You actually have to have the plumbing for the billions of dollars that have to move every month. Now, we're seeing this sort of activity that the West is engaging in a lot of the sanctions. It's not that the US or the West have dropped the nuclear option and just prevented the Russians from functioning. That would have too many side effects. Instead, the United States is working around the edges, the West is working around the edges, and making the Russians less and less welcome in any sort of economic activity that involves anything beyond their borders, and trying to use reputational risk as a way of inducing countries and companies to not do business with them. So, you could ship everything in that FedEx envelope and get by with it, but you would then have to ask whether FedEx would want to play, and they don't. And we're seeing this in energy, and we're seeing this in commodities, and we're seeing this in ag, and we're seeing this in finance. Now, this indirect approach to sanctions is not nearly as effective. It's not nearly as quick. It's not nearly as efficient. But it does prevent or at least limit some of the more undesirable side effects. So, for example, in energy, the United States could go out and just hijack a tanker carrying Russian crude. And that would set off cavitations throughout the entire system about what is allowed and what is not. And shipping companies then wouldn't want to touch it because you don't want to fall afoul of the U.S. Navy if you're into the job of shipping. And companies that work for foreign countries like, say, India probably would then leave for sure as well, because why would you put out all the risk and all the money if you might not just not get the crude, you might actually lose your vessel too. That would have implications for the entire shipping system, and they're trying to limit that sort of damage. Looking forward here, there is a significant negative outcome of this kind of half-assed approach to sanctions. Because the United States has now shown, the West has now shown, that it is willing to abrogate financial commitments from its citizens, from its companies, in its currency to other countries, even major countries. No legislation was required. No court case was required. There was no public comment period. It was just that the federal government decided to make this happen. I'm not overly concerned about the impact that this will have on the willingness of foreign countries to raise money and issue debt in the American market, because it's not like there's a lot of other places to go. All of the world's hard currencies are following the US lead here, every single one of them. So there is no back market place you can go. But there is a definite point of concern for the American investors that were willing to go into foreign countries in the first place. Their concern has always been about legal protection and rule of law in places like China or Russia or Venezuela or wherever else. But it never occurred to them that there might have actually been a risk on the American side of that equation. Because now they have to consider that not only will the United States not potentially provide them with legal protection on the American side should something go wrong in the foreign country, but the US government might actually be the reason that the investment fails because of a decision made by fiat. That's something that hasn't been true since before World War II, but suddenly now is again. This is going to redirect a lot of capital away from the world's developing and frontier markets. because all of a sudden they don't have a method to do it safely. And it doesn't matter if they've got a well-written bond agreement, doesn't matter if they've got an army of lawyers. If the controller of the global currency says no, the answer's no. And that's something they now have to factor in. And so if you're looking to borrow money on an American exchange, all of a sudden, you're going to have to work a lot harder to get American and Western investors to go along with it, because they no longer have that backstop of guarantee that they're used to. And that changes everything for the developing world.
Every time the United States does something that on a financial point of view, other countries are annoyed by, this conversation bubbles up again. This has been happening back and back and back since the 1980s. And every single time the dollar becomes more central. So the big shift this time around is that the Japanese and the Europeans both basically sublimated their own sanctions program to the US Fed and the US dollar. So they have seen a significant reduction in their global use over the course of the last few months, and the dollar has just gone up and up and up. The only currency swap trades that we have that are of any substance, and there's still less than 2% of the value of trade, is between Russia and China direct. But again, the Chinese don't want rubles and the Russians don't want yuan. The only reason this is working a little bit better this time is when the boycott of the Russian central bank kicked in, about the only foreign currency that the Russians had on hand at home was yuan. So it's really their only option to a certain degree. But they're actually using gold more. They're flying planes of gold to pay for imports right now. The problem has always been scale. Most countries in most parts of the world for most of history are very easy to disrupt. They don't have secure borders. They don't have everything they need within their own borders. So they can try to make incremental progress in this, that, or the other thing. But whenever there's a war or a boycott or a famine, it all falls apart. What the US fundamentally changed was because the North American continent has been secure for us for 150 years, we never had to worry about those resets. Even decades like the Great Depression, we exited the decade stronger than we entered it. And that meant that when the United States did decide to get involved with the world as a stabilizing force, we could kind of export that stability. And by making global transport on the ocean safe and cheap for everyone, we could finally have, instead of these hundreds of separate discriminatory economies, all kind of merge into a single global whole. And that had never happened before in human history. I mean, the closest analog would probably be the Roman Empire, but this is an age before steamships, so you're not moving too fast. And from that, everything suddenly changed, because that meant that everyone could specialize in whatever they did best. So the Koreans went into toys, into heavy industry, and ultimately into semiconductors. The Chinese went into mass manufacturing. So did San Antonio. In terms of energy, places that normally wouldn't be stable enough to support a population because there was no food production could export crude and import food. And that led them to produce more crude and start refining it. So every little bit of the system became fine-tuned for what they did best. My home state of Iowa stopped producing wheat and beef. That all moved to the drier climates of the Great Plains. We started doing soy and swine. Everybody's value added increased. And if you do that for 70 years, you get the world that we know. What's happening now is that single hole is breaking down. And so we now have to retrace every single economic sector and see what it looked like before this grand merger started in the 1950s. And in most parts of the world, it means reverting back to not just something that existed pre-1945, but something pre-industrial. Because a lot of the technologies that are required to do mass agriculture or manufacturing or finance can be imported, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily mastered. And if you can't keep your own supply chain and input system sustainable within whatever countries you can reach in a post-globalized system, then you just can't play. And so we're going to see, for example, a lot of Russian crude fall off the market. We're going to see a lot of Brazilian soy fall off the market. We're going to see Chinese manufacturers fall off the market. And we're all going to have to learn to do things differently or get by without. In the case of North America, it's a differently thing. And we're already, courtesy of Donald Trump, surprisingly well on our way.